It'll work. It's like open up in a web app, but it is functional, I guess. It didn't give me an option to open it up in like the... Well, it is PowerPoint, but it's like PowerPoint for the web or something. At home, it was giving me an option to open up an actual... But I'm okay with it. Yeah. Yeah. It's like every alternate weeks. Does the bell ring? Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. It's about time to get started here. I'm going to ask Jared if he's going to lead us in a word of prayer before we get going.
Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day that we've been blessed with and the opportunity and privilege we have to be here together to study your word. Pray that you would bless this study and this group of people, that we will all be edified by your word. Pray that you would be with Brett and with Travis as they teach this class to us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so the topic of this 6 weeks here in the auditorium is stewardship. And so I'll just start off with a question. Anyone can answer. What is stewardship? Foundation? Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Jimmy?
Taking care of something that's been entrusted to you.
I think that really gets to the core of it. And so I've got a definition I just pulled from a dictionary. So I think it really gets to the careful and responsible management of something that's entrusted to one's care. So stewardship entails managing things that don't belong to us for the benefit of the one that the things do belong to. So managing things that don't belong to us for the benefit of the owner. When we look at historical meanings or biblical meanings of this term, it's kind of this master-steward relationship that we see in the Bible, where this master would own a lot, far more than they could effectively manage for themselves, far more than they could handle day to day. So they would have these stewards or managers that were hired to assist the master to that end. And so that's how we want to think about this. We are God's agents or God's managers here on this earth, managing and stewarding His things for His benefit. And we get benefits as well from having these things here on earth, but that's the kind of the frame of mind that we want to have when we think about the things that we have here in this material earth. They are God's things, and we're managing them for His benefit. And so a huge part of stewardship and the most practical meaning and kind of the most common thing that we think about is related to physical things, assets and money, possessions, those kinds of things. But certainly God has given us many other things besides assets, money, and possessions that we have, that we also are to manage, that we also are entrusted to be responsible for and manage for God's benefit, but they aren't necessarily money. So what are a few of those things that He's given us that we're to manage that aren't money or possessions? Kids? Children? Yeah. Todd?
There's the earth, there's a term, land stewards.
Yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah. The physical earth, the land. Rick? Time, absolutely. That's a huge one. That's a material thing that doesn't exist in the eternal spiritual realm, really, that we have to manage for God. Lynn?
How do we also steward God's word? It's given to us through the Bible.
Absolutely.
Carry it to other people.
Yeah, good. Yes, sir. Our bodies. That's one I had. Absolutely. Physical bodies. Yes, ma'am. Time. Yes, that's been said, but that's good. That's really, really important one. Yeah. Bertha? Let's see. We've got time, our bodies, the earth, God's word, are a few of the things. Yep. How about our relationships? Relationships are pretty vital, important, necessary. We've got to take care of those, nurture those, especially our Christian relationships, the husband and wife relationship. Children was one that was mentioned also. Skills or abilities, just the talents that we have that may be unique to us, things that we can do well, that we can use for God's purposes. So I think that covers a lot of it. Another question I have for the class, are there certain people who are stewards and certain people who are not? No. So everyone is a steward. And that's one of the points I wanted to get across is this study is for everyone, because it's not dependent on some amount or some quantity of wealth that we may or may not have. There is no qualifying amount to be considered a steward of God's things. You can be very young, you can be old, male or female. You can live in a mansion or a castle, or you could be homeless, or you could live in a tent. Your primary means of transportation could be riding around in a limousine, or it could be walking. It doesn't depend on how much you have or what you have. Whether you're good with money or you don't consider yourself good with money, I've seen, probably observed in the husband and wife relationship, a lot of times there's one in the relationship who will kind of handle the money things. I've seen this sentiment, well, my job as the husband is to provide, I'm going to go out and work, and I'll bring home the paycheck, and then you, wife, here, your job is to decide what to do with it. And I don't believe that's a good idea of what stewardship is. Whether or not you're good with money, you are still responsible for the things that you have, and see to it that those things that we have are used for God's purposes. So we've all been given something, and it's the faithful Christian's duty to manage those things that we do have for God. And faithfulness to God is seen on both ends of the spectrum in the Bible. Are you blessed? Are you wealthy? Then this study is for you. Are you struggling? Are you barely getting by? This study is for you too. So we have some biblical examples of rich servants of God and poor servants of God that both served God faithfully. And I want to take a look at a few of those this morning. So Noah mentioned in the 9 o'clock hour, he referenced Elijah, and I want to look at Elijah as well. The story of Elijah is found throughout the book of 1 Kings, but 1 Kings 17 is kind of where I want to look. And from all indications, from what we see in 1 Kings 17, the prophet Elijah owns really nothing in the sense of material possessions. He's seen here subsisting on 2 meals a day, provided directly from God by means of this raven that's delivering him bread and meat, and he's drinking water from a stream. And when the stream dries up, what's Elijah's next source of physical means? Well, we looked at the ravens. The ravens are bringing in stuff, but after that, the stream dries up. He's got to leave that area. Yeah, he goes to the widow. So he's got this poor widow who herself is very poor, and there's been this famine in the land, and she's running out of provisions, and so we see God feeding Elijah and feeding the widow and her son miraculously through this unending supply of flour and oil. And so this period of famine lasts for 3.5 years, and Elijah was dirt poor, living only on what God had given him to subsist from day to day. And though Elijah was poor physically, he was spiritually rich. During his life, faced adversity numerous times, discouragement, perhaps even depression. And though he was physically poor, he was a faithful servant of God. At times, Elijah felt alone. He didn't understand God's plan. But he became God's vessel to raise a boy from the dead. He became God's vessel to triumph on Mount Carmel. He rained down fire from heaven that consumed the prophets of Baal. And besides all these dramatic events, he also carried out his role of a prophet, speaking to Ahab and to others, proclaiming the word of the Lord throughout his life. And in the end of Elijah's physical life, he was one of the few men who was taken directly up into heaven. He's mentioned numerous times, referenced numerous times in the New Testament, and he was even with Jesus at the Transfiguration. So Elijah, a poor man, but spiritually rich, and he served God even though he was physically poor. Let's go to Matthew chapter 8 and look at verse 19. So how about Jesus? Jesus was not physically well off. Matthew chapter 8, verses 19 and 20. Can I get a reader for that? Travis.
The scribe came up and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head."
So Jesus, although he had places to stay, he didn't own a home of his own. You might consider him homeless, just kind of wandering from place to place. Jesus did work as a carpenter earlier in his life, and he did use money. We see references to a money bag that Jesus and the 12 disciples carried around. But Jesus had no permanent home. And I would say that Jesus was definitely physically poor, but he was the most spiritually rich person to have ever walked the earth. Any questions or comments so far? All right, let's go to Mark chapter 12, please. And let's look at verse 41. I get a volunteer to read Mark 12, 41 through 44. John?
And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow
Thanks, John. So the poor widow had the right perspective. She understood the importance of giving, and despite her poverty, despite having very little, next to nothing, she trusted that even though she gave all she had, that God was going to provide for her. And she put her hope and trust in God and not in what little that she did have. So even in her poverty, the poor widow was faithful and pleasing to God. So let's kind of look at the other end of the spectrum here. And I want to go to Genesis chapter 13 and in verse 2. Short verse here, Genesis 13:2. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So that's pretty self-explanatory there. And it's not mentioned in this passage, but it is recorded elsewhere that in Genesis that Abraham had 318 of his own servants who were trained militarily. And we're not talking just about workers or laborers. These are military trained men. And so Abraham effectively had his own small army that he did use. He ended up rescuing Lot with it from these other kings at one point in time. So that's really a testament to me. When you have your own army, you're doing pretty well. You're pretty wealthy. So Abraham's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, a very, very rich man. And another reference to Abraham that's found in James chapter 2 in verse 23. James 2:23 reads, "And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God." So Abraham, a wealthy man, a righteous man, a man, I don't know what better honor could be bestowed upon someone than to be called a friend of God. Another character we have is Job. Job is interesting because he was both very rich and very poor during his life. And when he was rich, he was faithful to God. When he was poor, he remained faithful to God. And when giving a defense of his conduct, Job says that he used his wealth for God's glory, which is how it should be used. So if we can, let's go to Job chapter 31, and we're going to start in verse 16. So if I can get a volunteer, let's read Job 31, 16 through 25. Okay, Dan.
If I have withheld anything that the poor desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it. For from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, because I saw my help in the gate, and let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket, for I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. If I have made gold my trust, or called fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much.
Yeah, so we see generosity toward the needy. Orphans, widows are specifically mentioned. He mentions he had all these things, and at the end of the reading there, he says, I didn't place my trust in these things, even though I had them. Continuing on in verse 31, he says, if the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? The sojourner has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the travelers. And down in verse 38, if my land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment, and made its owners breathe their last. So, Job used his wealth generously. He cared for widows and orphans. He was hospitable with what he had. He did not gain his wealth through the exploitation of his workers, of his servants, and he didn't place his ultimate security in it. So after having looked at all of these examples, Elijah and Jesus, Abraham and Job, and the poor widow, what's the conclusion that can be drawn here from looking at these biblical examples? Travis.
It's not the amount, it's what you do with it. What's your purpose and what's your intent and where's your heart and your mind and where is it going? And God is not concerned with the amount. He's concerned with what you do with what you've been given.
Yeah, good. Noah?
To emphasize the last part of what Travis said, God cares. And that's very clear when we see that the faithfulness of how people used what they did or did not have is acknowledged and praised.
Absolutely. Yeah, God acknowledges what we do, and he will reward us or not based on what we do with it. Rick?
As we find in the royal law, when God is first in our lives, everything else seems to fall into place a whole bunch easier. Our use of our time, our use of our abilities, our use of our funds, it makes more sense, and it's easier to have the priorities set correct when God is first.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm going to touch on that point a little bit more later. That's good. Lynn?
I was going to say, no one is exempt from being a steward. Like, we tend to think, oh, I don't have enough money, I can't help in
Yeah.
the church in any way. But there, like Rick said, there's many other ways to help just using our time.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jared.
Job's also acknowledging here he has a lot of responsibility to the people that he might not otherwise because of his wealth.
Right.
And he names them off. He names the poor, the widows, the fatherless, the travelers. It's just like he goes through all of these responsibilities that he has because of the wealth that he has, because he can help.
Right. Yeah. Job understood that because of what he did have, his responsibilities were greater than many others. And going back to what Lynn said, just because we may not have much and we may not think that we can make a big difference with what we do have monetarily, there still is a monetary responsibility even for the poor person. I think that parable of the poor widow really illustrates that. Even though she had 2 copper coins, she did give them to God, and God was pleased with her offering. Yeah.
I think everybody has responsibility, and we all have stewardship. Some of us have different responsibilities in stewardship
Yeah.
than others, though. And so I think the call is to be keenly aware. What are my responsibilities with like the position that I have in the church or the physical goods that have been entrusted to me by the Lord or my talents or whatever. But it will be different for every individual.
Sure. Yeah, it's gonna be different for everyone. So yeah, I think the conclusion that can be drawn in addition to what's been said is that all are stewards, the poor and the rich, everyone in between. All the examples we looked at were faithful to God with the material things that they had. And we just looked at these biblical examples from both ends of the spectrum that shows us that no matter where we lie on that spectrum, we can be faithful and pleasing to God. And so, kind of after having drawn that conclusion, I think we can infer that a study of this topic is profitable for all. And I think that we'll find that it's more than just it can be more than just profitable for us, but it's absolutely necessary. Let's go to Luke chapter 16. Before we move on, are there any more thoughts or comments, Travis?
Just anecdotally, I mean, we have those among us who have adopted, who are very engaged in helping those who would otherwise potentially be orphaned. So, praise be to God for them and their love and their care. But anecdotally, one of the things that left a big impression on me when I was able to go to Zimbabwe was you have very poor families that are very large, have very large households, and you start to ask why. Well, it's because they've adopted or taken in so many people who otherwise may have just perished.
Right.
And they didn't have much. Like, they had not been blessed with physical wealth, and still they took these burdens on because of their love and their care and the stewardship of, hey, here's a person who's been put in front of me. This is an opportunity, and I'm going to go take it.
Yeah, that's good. That's an inspiring example when you see something like that. Yes, Debbie.
In our relationship with one another, sometimes we are judgmental about people's stewardship ability based on the fact that they're able to do more in our eyes than other people. And we need to be careful of that because God right here has said he was pleased with the widow. She had little,
Yeah.
but she did everything that she could with it. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at other people too, about their handling their stewardship or their abilities.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's an attitude that can develop, and perhaps a judgmental attitude between either people who don't have a lot toward people that do, or the reverse. I think both can be true. I'm going to dive into depth a little bit more on that on Wednesday. All right, I need to get a reader, please, for Luke chapter 16. I want to read verses 1 through 15. This is the parable of the dishonest manager. Can I get a volunteer to read that? Noah? Oh, sorry.
He also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and the charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do.
All right, thank you, Noah. So that was a pretty lengthy reading, 15 verses there. Can someone give me a quick summary of what happened here in this parable? Yeah? Steward got fired. Yeah, exactly. So we have this rich man's manager or steward who was wasteful. He was forced to give an account of his management, and he was fired. He realized that he was sunk. He was kind of done for at this point. And so, in an attempt to avoid hard manual labor or begging, he devised this plan to secure for himself a place to live. Since he was no longer going to have a place to live once he was fired. So he gave discounts to all these debtors that owed his master money, and so that they would favor him and appreciate him. He made friends with these debtors, and so they'd take him in later. So some things I think that we can take from this parable are that we are stewards, as we've kind of pointed out already. We're stewards of another's possessions, just as this steward was a steward of his master's possessions. Being a steward, those things that he managed were not his own. They belonged to the master. And the same is true of us. Everything we have in this life will be returned to the owner, God. And we're going to be accountable for what happened to those things while they were under our management. The dishonest manager in the story, I may have given this away earlier, but what kind of friends did he make? Who did he make friends with? What's that? Yeah, well, specifically, it was the debtors, right? Yeah. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they got some unethical things there. They agreed to take these things. So he made friends with the master's debtors. What was his goal in making these friends?
He was opportunistic. He was seeking out those who would be able to help him later.
Yes, absolutely. So he was trying to secure a place to live. That was his goal. Let's read Luke 16 and verse 9 again. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. That's ESV. The New American Standard reads, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of the unrighteous, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. So Jesus is telling us, he's telling those that he told the parable to in that day to make friends. And so a question for the class, who are the friends that we are supposed to make? Jimmy?
It says that they may receive you into an everlasting home.
That kind of narrows it down, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. So who are those who are able to give us an everlasting home? God, right? It's mentioned kind of in the plural there, so I think you can say it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this is probably maybe not for the whole class, maybe, I don't know. It's an extremely important point that I don't think we need to lose sight of. But we are to make friends with God by means of our material possessions. And like Jimmy said, the reason I think that we can know that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are the ones who we're supposed to make friends with is because they are the only ones who can provide that eternal dwelling. So he says we are to make these friends by means of unrighteous wealth. I believe the unrighteous wealth refers to material things, more specifically to money and possessions, things like that. Why do you think that material goods here are described as unrighteous?
They're carnal, they're fleshly, they're of the world.
They're of the world, yeah. So I don't think there's anything, I don't think when it says they're unrighteous, it's saying that they're evil or anything to that extent. They're called unrighteous in the sense that they're kind of disposed to unrighteousness, if you think about it. Money and wealth are things that are so frequently idolized and used in the wrong way, in a worldly way. And I think there's a parallel that can be found in Romans chapter 8 in verse 3. I'm going to take a look at that. Romans 8 and verse 3 says, for God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And so we have this reference to Jesus being sent in the likeness of sinful flesh. Are our bodies inherently sinful? No. I think that there's a parallel there. It's a physical thing. It's a carnal thing. And they're typically disposed to sinful things. Money and possessions are, in and of themselves, neither good nor bad. You can do good or bad things with them, but they're inanimate. The point of the parable deals with what we do with these money and possessions that is of real consequence, and not necessarily that they're inherently good or bad. Rick?
One of the interesting things about this parable is it doesn't really say how he got into such a strait of owing more money than he could ever pay back in his lifetime. But I think the inclination is that it was not a good thing to do. So stewardship of possessions is also stewardship of debt. And when we look at this and we see that this individual was so steeped in debt that there was no way that he was ever going to pay it back in his lifetime, and it makes no difference whether he actually really didn't mean to be evil about doing this or whether he did actually make the debt by evil intention. It was still a condemnation, and it was still a condemnation by the master. So, for us to think about this and to look at this servant, we need to consider our debt and how we acquire our debt as well, because a debt is a form of a negative possession, and it can rule us probably easier than a possession that we have of positive things.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of debt and uncontrollable debt especially is something that we're going to touch on later in the class. I think, though, that the point of this parable is not that the steward had personal debt, really. It was more so of the way he wasn't managing the things like he was supposed to for the purpose of the master. And so I don't know how much of that was directly his debt, but he was definitely squandering those things which weren't his. And certainly he probably owed the master for the things that he was responsible for that he lost. So in that sense, I guess you could say he did have some debt there. We got about 5 minutes left. I do want to make the point that we are to make friends with God with our possessions, with our money and possessions. In the way that we do that, how do we, that's kind of an interesting concept. Maybe we don't see in the scriptures a lot. How do we make friends with God with the things that we have physically? And I think the answer there is to direct all of our material opportunities toward God. we live in a physical world. We live in a material world. We don't live in a spiritual world at this point. And so we have to direct all of these physical things, our work, our assets, our money and possessions, our giving, charity, benevolence, all of these things that we mentioned earlier, our bodies, our relationships, our children, our talents, all these things towards God. And when we please God with those things, and when we serve God with those things, just as the unjust steward served his master's debtors, God's going to give us an eternal home, just like those debtors gave that man a physical home. And when we lose the wealth, verse 9 says, when it fails, referencing the wealth there, because it will. When it fails, we're either going to lose it while we're alive, or we're going to lose it upon death. The sons of light will have friendship with God and receive that eternal dwelling. Jimmy?
And that goes with the verse saying, lay up for yourself treasures in heaven.
Yeah.
We can take what we have, we can either use it to lay up treasures in heaven, or we can spend it on ourselves, but it's still God's, whichever we've done.
Yeah, good. Okay. Looking at verse 10, Luke 16, verse 10 through 13. Verse 10 says, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you've not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? So he's referring back to this unrighteous wealth that we just talked about. These verses are saying that faithful stewardship of material things is ground level. I mean, it's basic Christianity. If we can't steward these material things, then we're not going to receive the eternal things. That's just how important this subject is. Maybe in the past we've been afraid to talk about it. Maybe it's not that we're afraid, it's just that we haven't considered it thoughtfully enough. But I do feel there's a sense from some, and it's not so much that it's spoken outright, but more so in people's actions, that there's this separation between the physical things in our lives and the spiritual parts of our lives, that they're unrelated. And again, not that someone would blatantly say this outright, but there's this sense that, well, what I have is in regards to my money and possessions, it's none of anybody's business. It's just something I have that I have to get by. It's necessary in this life. It's not anybody's business. It's not even God's business. It's a necessary thing that we have, but it has nothing to do with my spirituality and my relationship with God. And I think Jesus very firmly dispels that sentiment here, that how we interact with unrighteous wealth, as it's termed, with money and possessions, how we serve or do not serve God with every material opportunity that we have, is directly linked to whether or not we're making friends with God and whether or not He will receive us into an eternal home. So I think the conclusion that can be drawn there is that salvation is dependent on proper stewardship of the things that we have on this earth. So I'll go ahead and stop there. We've got just a minute left, and then we'll continue on Wednesday. If anyone does not have the handouts, they're out on that wooden table out there in the foyer this week and the next week that Travis will be teaching.